Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 31 of the podcast. Now, before we get started on this episode on the common mistakes that students make in our training, I want to give a shout out to Kay Lucas. He's been a patron of mine for almost 2 years now. And it's thanks to Kay's support and that of all my other patrons that I'm able to do what I do and bring you these episodes and guests that I interview. So a huge shout out again and a thank you to Kay for his continued support. And if you also want to check out everything we have over at Patreon, and that's quite a lot, we've got let's say a very interesting and building increasingly bigger library of content, video written and other things that is only available to my patrons. So head on over to patreon.com/Demeere and I'll see you there. Now, that said, a few quick updates before we get started. And the first one is that I'm trying something new. So you can obviously listen to the podcast right here, but I've been posting it on YouTube for a while now. And I'm trying something new with this episode, and you will also be able to not only listen to the episode on YouTube, but also watch me. I'm waving at the camera right now. So just trying something new, see if that is a format that people seem to like. I know a lot of podcasters do it as well. They have a video of them recording the podcast. I'm giving this a try. So if you want to watch me do crazy stuff while I am recording this, then head on over to my YouTube channel. Again, I'll put a link in the show notes. And for those of you who don't know how this works, you go to wimsblog.com/31, the numeral. And then that'll take you to my page where I have all the links to all the stuff that I mentioned in each episode. So go there, link to my YouTube page, and then maybe you like that better, watching it and listening on YouTube. I do. There's several podcasts that I follow on YouTube because I like to see the people involved and so on, and that might be a thing for you. So giving it a try, see what happens. That's the first update. And the second one, I'm bringing this back to Patreon because I am doing a special on Patreon this month. April is Violence Analysis Month. Now, what does that mean? I do a series of videos. I've been doing a series of videos for a while now on Patreon. It's called Violence Analysis. And in that, I take a video of something that happened in real life, an incident of somebody ending up in a street fight, being mugged, or anything relating to self-defense and violence. And then I break it down and try to draw out the lessons that you and I can then use for our own training and keeping ourselves and our loved ones safe. So that is what I do every month. And those videos tend to be somewhere around anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes long, depending on what's going on in that specific video. Now, why am I doing this in April, this special? Well, as some of you who've been following with me for a while know, I have a birthday coming up. I will be 47 not that long. And it's something I do every year, try to give back to the people who've supported me. And almost every year I do something along the lines of making one of my books available at a very, very much discounted price, usually 99 cents for the day for one day, just to give people access to that material and just to thank them for supporting my work for all this time. Now I'll probably do something similar as well, but I wanted to do something special for my patrons because it's my third year on Patreon right now. And I'm doing a special on violence analysis with every single week doing an analysis of a video that my patrons choose. Not something I choose, but something that they choose. So I asked them, like, right, send me a bunch of links to videos that you find either interesting or you think they're worthwhile discussing, or you have questions about that and you'd like my take on it. So I asked my patrons to send in some examples of those kinds of things, and I'm still open to suggestions. I've gotten a bunch, but I'm always open to see more because I want to do preferably a variety of different kinds of incidents. So not just always two drunks fighting, for instance. I mean, don't want to do 4 videos in a row of that, but different kinds of incidents, and then hopefully try to give you guys the takeaways. Now, what I'll also do during that month of April, I will do on Patreon an explanation of the method that I use to analyze those videos. I've gotten requests for that as well, trying to explain like, okay, well, you see different things that I do, how come? Well, I'll explain that a little bit more and give you guys sort of a matrix to put the videos in that you see and draw out information that you might otherwise miss. That's just my take on things. I don't claim to have the best or the whatever view on these kind of things, but it's just, I'll just explain how I work, and then you will be able to determine whether you can use that or not. So that's what's going on in April. Again, go on to patreon.com/Wim Demeere, and then you will find it. Hop on in. I should mention that all these videos, these 4 videos, will be available at the lowest reward tier that starts at $1 a month. So everybody will get to see those, all my patrons, I should say, will get to see these 4 videos. And I've already actually started with one of these, an incident where something happens with somebody wielding a knife that is usually, well, it's often said that kind of thing doesn't happen, and then it does happen, and I break it down a little bit as to what was going on there. So that's it for pretty much the updates. That's all I had. So I had to mention the finance analysis this month. We're on YouTube, and now we can delve into pretty much the main topic of this podcast, and that is, well, how about students getting things wrong? What are some of the most common mistakes? And there are a bunch. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but I've been teaching for a pretty long time. What I can say is that, well, students tend to make mistakes. We all do. And that includes us teachers who are still students, obviously, as well. So having been in the martial arts and in self-defense for a long time, I can list you dozens and dozens of my own, but that wouldn't be very helpful. So what I'm going to do is something different, and I'll take the slant of how do I, as a teacher, view these kind of things. So what are the mistakes that I see students make when I'm teaching? I've been teaching for a long time. I started teaching as an assistant to one of my instructors when I was about 16, 17. And it was just him letting me do the warm-up, stuff like that, and then showing some basics to new students. That's how it started. And when I was about 21, I started teaching professionally. Made tons and tons of mistakes. And many people tell me now that I'm a good teacher. I tried very hard to become one, but I can very definitely confirm that I was not such a great teacher when I was younger and just starting out. I had a lot to learn. And I was fortunate to find a bunch of really good teachers to show me the ropes and learn from their example. So that's a little bit of my background, and obviously as many of you know also, I'm a personal trainer, so I teach people for a living, martial arts, self-defense, conditioning, lots more, every day. So I'm teaching every single day. So I've been doing that for a really, really long time now. So yeah, pretty much 30 years of teaching experience with a wide variety of settings, one-on-one, group classes, seminars, and so on. So I think I have some experience, and that's why I wanted to take this, like I said, this slant of what do I see as a teacher do students wrong? Meaning what are the most common mistakes students make and how you can avoid them. And I'll start with the first one. And I think this is the most important one, and it is not seeing what the teacher shows. So they don't see what is shown. I could also label this mistake differently, and I could say not knowing what to look for, which is pretty much the same thing, but taken from a different perspective. Now, before I go on, I am not blaming students for making this mistake. It's not your fault if you don't have the experience yet to really analyze a technique as it is being shown to you and remember the different steps and so on. That takes training, that takes time. but you need to learn somewhere. You need to start learning somewhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, what's going on here with this mistake, and obviously how you can fix it. Now, you need a framework to thinking. I think that's the critical point. Learning a physical technique, a physical skill, whether it is self-defense, whether it is, I don't know, pick any sport, a layup in basketball, doesn't matter. It takes practice, but it also takes practice to know how you can learn when somebody shows you how to do that and how to correct that and so on. And there's always more to learn, but you need to know how to see what's actually going on. Here are some of the factors that I see students getting wrong all the time. And the first one is distinguishing between left and right. Now, some of you might find that really, really funny, but the teachers among you know full well what I'm talking about. Now, and this starts with very basic stuff like some people just have a hard time remembering left from right. That's just how their brain is wired. It happens. If you teach children, you see this happen. This happens all the time. So you stop saying left and right sometimes eventually and go about it a different way. But with adults, that still happens. Now, it isn't necessarily a matter of always them not knowing the difference between left and right because of the way their brain is wired, but also that they don't remember because let's say you do a 5-part technique and then they just forget they focus on part 1 and 2, and then they forget what is in 3 and 4, and then they remember 5, the last part. And in 3 and 4, they just mess things up because they have a vague notion of it, but they don't remember it fully. That's normal. But that means the technique doesn't necessarily work, or it doesn't work as well, or they run into issues. So distinguishing between left and right is one of the first things you need to do, is that what is your teacher doing? Is he using his left hand to block or his right hand? Is he, when it's, for instance, you're doing some sort of submission, which grip is on top? Is it the left hand? Is it the right hand? Or he's changing hands. Okay, where is that left hand before it starts moving, and where is that left hand when it finishes? And if you mess up that order, sometimes, well, you don't get the lock because you just gave your opponent an opening to break free and he's gone. So distinguishing between left and right is a critical skill. And it is something that you take into that framework that you use to remember and analyze and try out the techniques that are shown in class. I see this all the time when I show a self-defense application that is more than let's say two components. You don't always get to choose. So people always say, keep it simple. Of course, I agree with that, but there's plenty of situations called that way when you're in a self-defense context where you do more than one thing in succession until you can get back to safety, where it's not just one physical movement that you make and then you're done. If you break it down, sometimes you get to dozens of physical movements, and somebody's done something really simple, but their body has moved in a variety of ways for dozens of times before they get to get clear and get away from whoever's attacking them. So what I mean with that is, if you've got a lot of information on your plate, it's easy to forget which hand or which leg does what. But you need to remember that. You need to remember that because otherwise the technique either doesn't work or it breaks down eventually, it works less, or you put yourself in danger. Let's say that you do a technique, you defend against an incoming punch, get out the way, whatever, pick a defense, and then you use the wrong arm to hit the person. Now, might not be an issue in and of itself. However, by using the wrong arm, for instance, you don't protect yourself on a specific side as you try to counter him. And as it so happens, that specific side is where he has a free arm. That's the arm that you didn't block. He's got two arms. So he might hit you as you try to go for your counter. And then we get into all these discussions about timing and so on and distance and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go into that, but my point is that if you would have used the right arm, it wouldn't have been an issue, or it wouldn't have been as much of an issue. So that's the kind of thing that you have to just bear in mind. If you make mistakes, or if you watch your teacher show something, okay, which arm, which leg is doing what? going left, going right, and so on. So then the second most common mistake that I see when students mess things up is that they don't watch the footwork as much as they watch what the arms and hands are doing. Now it's normal that you watch the hands, because in many cases the hands and the arms and the upper body is where most of the technique is at. Not always, but in many cases. But then they forget the footwork, which is also in many cases what makes the technique possible to begin with. Now, very recently I put a video online where I showed an example of my teacher getting exactly this wrong. So they used the wrong arm in the wrong spot in the technique in a specific variation, and for the reasons that I mentioned before, but also that there was an issue that they weren't paying attention to, and that was a footwork. Now, it was very simple. I'll put a link in the show notes to this video, because I think I posted it on Facebook, and it's basically dependent on the footwork, where you place the foot. What that means is that if you place the foot in front of your opponent's leg, it's the left arm that is closest to the target, and then is going to be used instinctively, or should be used instinctively, to strike the opponent. If you place your foot behind his lead leg, which is also a valid choice, you use the right arm in this specific technique. And that was my point to my students, is like, right, it's not right or wrong per se to use that left or the right arm. It's just that depending on your footwork, one arm will be in a much better position to strike than the other. Now, you can always choose the footwork, that is true, but what you can choose in many cases is which arm you use. So he's going to determine where you place your feet, often depending on how he attacks, but you get to choose what you do with your own body. So my point to them was that, look, this is something that you have to pay attention to, and that is an illustration of what I just said, is that students tend to forget to watch the footwork. They tend to forget or not pay as much attention to what the legs are doing, which then results in being at the wrong angle, being at the wrong distance, using the wrong arm, and all these different things that I just mentioned. So moving on to another factor that is involved to see what your teacher is doing is looking at the body mechanics. What's his body doing? How is it coordinated? How is it working? This is something that I believe should be addressed very early on in training, with a very simple explanation of the body mechanics in your style, and so that the students have a rough idea of how this is supposed to work. And then obviously they refine that as they get more practice, but you need to know what the body mechanics are. Is there body rotation involved? Is there torque involved? Meaning, will the spine rotate or not? If it does, well, how does it rotate? Is it a full body rotation? Is it just the upper body? Hip hinge, so is the torso inclining or declining? Another aspect is, are you transferring weight? Are you staying in the same spot? Are you transferring weight? And if so, how are you doing that? So all these kind of things make a huge difference. And for example, there's an arm bar that I like to do. It doesn't look like much. And when you watch just the upper body, it doesn't make any sense. But when you watch what my lower body is doing, and in particular how it is coordinated, you'll see that I'm doing a weight transfer, in which I am transferring my weight from my back leg to my front leg as I apply the arm bar, which means that my entire body weight is backing up that arm bar. It's just not arm strength. And this is typically a mistake that beginning students get wrong, is that they don't see that. They only see the teacher grabbing the student's arm, putting him in an arm bar, and seemingly effortlessly putting him on the ground with it. And then they try to do that, to copy that by just yanking on that arm real hard and putting a lot of strength in it, and then they don't get why it doesn't work, or the student is able to resist relatively well. Now, point on, look, this is the footwork. Look at what my feet are doing. I'm stepping out and then I'm transferring my weight. So the body mechanics and the footwork are actually working together. And then I can tell my students, remember the first class, what did we do? We did basics, basic structure. basic weight transfer, and basic footwork. So that's in my school, that is the very first class, always for everybody, regardless if you have previous knowledge, because we do it in a very specific way that is particular to our art, with as a result that if you use different footwork, different body mechanics, a lot of stuff doesn't work or doesn't work as well. And I've had this many times. One of my students spent a long time in traditional jiu-jitsu, and specific body mechanics were ingrained into him, and they are contrary to some of the mechanics that we do in our style, which means that he has a hard time. It's not easy. And again, I get it, but this is something you need to be able to correct eventually, or you will always stay stuck at a certain level, which I will talk about a little bit later. Now, another aspect, another factor that you need to pay attention to really see what the teacher is showing is what happens when. So this boils down to understanding the sequence of events. If you like, you can pretend that your teacher is telling a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Well, if you mix those around, if you start with the end and then throw the beginning right after and then end with the middle part of the story doesn't make sense. It's the same thing with techniques. There is a first step, then a next, and so on, and depending on the technique, there might be numerous steps or just a handful. Either way, you have to remember the sequence. And then it gets tricky, because then you have to not only watch the sequence, but also what is happening at the same time. So did he first step and then do a deflection with his hand, or did he first do the deflection and then step in, or did both these things happen at the same moment? So that is an additional difficulty when you watch the sequence, is that it's not always just one thing and then another thing. In the first part of the sequence, it might be the arm and the leg move at the same time. In the second part of the sequence, it might be just the upper body moving, or it might be upper and lower body moving at the same time. It doesn't matter which technique you do, but the sequence will always be there. So try to see what your teacher is showing one bit at a time. Break it down in steps if you need to. In your head, just say, okay, step 1, he does this. Step 2, he does that. And most teachers break it down like that. They show it in a sequential order so that you can learn better. So remember the sequence. Here's another interesting, it's a triple set actually of things that I always point out to, that one of my teachers pointed out, and it's timing, orientation, and distance. These are the 3 that will always change when you work with somebody, and they change every single attack, sometimes slightly, and when you work with different partners, they can vary tremendously. These 3, timing, orientation, and distance, work as such. So timing has basically 3 timings. We can get a little bit into the details about that. You can start going into more nuanced statements, but for this broadcast, I'm going to keep it relatively simple and say that there's before, during, and after. What that means is that, and I'm going to take a simple example so it's easier to understand the concept, but obviously, again, we can get a lot more complex than that. So you can, and I'll start with after because that's the easiest one. So your partner's going to throw a punch at you, he's going to throw a big haymaker. You do a technique after he is done throwing that haymaker. That's a specific kind of timing. Your technique might be that you only get to hit him after you dodge that punch. You duck underneath and then you get to hit him. During would be different. During would be that as he throws that haymaker, you step in to block it and strike at the same time. So timing is different. This is a little bit more difficult, but it's also more effective because he doesn't get to finish the strike, and as he is punching, you're already hitting him. And then we have before. What this means, and again, this gets tricky because people have their own interpretations of it, which is fine. Before means that as he is getting ready to throw the technique, and in some cases, just as it starts throwing the technique, but it hasn't had the time to gather any speed or power, you hit him. Or you do your technique, whatever technique may be. So that's before, during, and after timing. And I've noticed that many students get this wrong, is that they try a technique that is supposed to be done during whatever your opponent is doing, and then they do it before or after, or in any other variation of these 3 possibilities. When you do that, obviously the technique is going to fail. And that is where a lot of students mess up, and they say, well, the technique doesn't work. And then I, as a teacher, say, no, it doesn't work because you didn't do what I show you. And here, let me show you why. And then we can correct that. So timing plays a huge, huge part in the learning process. And then we have orientation. Orientation means which angle are you at in relation to your opponent. Many different ways of explaining that concept, but I'll take the easiest one, and that is, let's say that you are facing your opponent and he's at your 12 o'clock and you're standing on your 6, and from his perspective it's vice versa. Now if you move towards 1 o'clock or you move towards 3 o'clock, well, that is totally different. You're oriented in a different direction. If he moves straight towards you, which would be your 6 o'clock, or he moves towards your 11 or 1 o'clock, he's coming in at a different angle than would he come in straight, which obviously is going to change what you do. Now, again, this becomes very complex and mathematical, if you like. I'm not going to go into that, but the point is that you need to know what is the orientation towards or away from your opponent. And then you can make the technique work or not. There are techniques that I see students get wrong when they simply try to force an orientation on the opponent or the training partner in this case, obviously, and it doesn't work. For instance, what I often see students do is they turn away from the partner as they perform a technique instead of driving through him. What that means is that their center line is no longer aiming at his center line, and they're turning their body away, which in turn then often breaks down the efficiency of the technique, breaks down the structure, changes the timing and the distance, and at the same time gives the opponent a chance to either recover or attack them. So orientation, what angle are you at in relation to your partner? What angle is he at in relation to you? In what angle and orientation are you moving into him, away from him, and so on? All these different variabilities that exist when you look at orientation play a huge part in messing up a technique or getting it right. And then the final of these three is distance. Now, distance means how far are you away from your opponent. An easy way to measure this is that you take a measuring tape and you hold it on your belly button, and your partner does the same. And then you look at the tape and what number does it say? That's the distance. If you take a step closer, the number will be lower. If you take a step back, that number will be higher. Well, that number is distance. Now, distance, timing, and orientation are all connected to each other. Because if I change the timing, I can get closer, or I will be forced to stay further back depending on that change. And the same with orientation. If I'm oriented correctly on my opponent, I often don't need to cover the same type of distance, which in turn then changes timing, which in turn then changes his orientation once I get to him. So distance is something that we always see, and we say this about, pretty much everything in my school. The concept is Chungyong, which could be translated roughly as the golden mean. And what my teacher would say is then he would say, well, not too close, not too far. What does that mean? It means not too close, not too far. Be in the golden mean, be at the right spot. Now, what I often add to that to my students is right spot for you, which will not be the same for me. And it also will not be the same when somebody else attacks you. And this is where all the training comes in. This is where you have to practice. Because as every single time somebody attacks you in training, timing, orientation, and distance will be different. You need to learn to adapt the technique to those three factors. And that is very often where things go wrong. I have students practicing with one partner, and then they know how to handle it, and then they work with another partner a few minutes later, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. In the most incidents that are, well, not incidents, in the most cases like that, it's timing, orientation, and distance that end up wrong. So that is something that I would very much recommend that you also take into account when you want to avoid these common mistakes. Now, here's a tip from me as a teacher. When your teacher shows something, watch what he does, and then physically stand in the same orientation as he is towards his training partner. So that means that if he is facing his training partner and he has his back to the window, you also stand in the same orientation, put your back to the window, standing a few feet away from your teacher, of course, but put yourself in the same orientation. And then you mimic in miniature what he's doing. So you just want to get a feel for the technique. You're not doing it in the same in largesse as he does, but you're doing small miniature versions of taking a step forward, lifting your right hand, then punching with the left one, and blah blah blah. You're just copying him, trying to basically follow him as he does that. You don't have to do it every single time, but if what I typically do when I'm learning something new is that I watch, I try to think, I go through my checklist, and many of the items that I've just listed here above are on that checklist. I will go through that, and then I will try to mimic the teacher a little bit in such a way that I'm not disturbing anybody, in such a way that I'm not stepping on somebody's toes who's standing next to me, but just doing it in a really small version so that I can get a feel. I get it's kinesthetic learning. I'm letting my body feel this is how it's going to feel in a minute when I have a partner to use this technique on. So try that tip, see if it works for you, and if not, adapt it to whatever you need. Now, long story short on that first one, but I expand a little bit more on it because I think it's such an important part of getting things wrong and how to fix that. I'm going to move on to the next one, and the next most common mistake students in martial arts and self-defense classes make is not being a good partner. Being a good partner is difficult. It takes practice, it takes effort, it takes will. You have to put yourself, so to speak, at the mercy of your partner. You have to trust him, and you have to be willing to take the fall, sometimes literally for him, so he can get to practice. And then the deal is that he then should do the same to you. That's the deal. Now, if either one of you doesn't stick to that deal, well, then it's not going to work. Somebody is not going to learn something, and you might probably not learn what you're supposed to learn. So in that regard, being a good training partner is a vital component of practicing and learning. And it's everywhere. It's not just the martial arts self-defense. This is true everywhere. If you go to whatever business course and you have to role play a situation and then apply whatever you've just learned. Let's say that it's a sales meeting and that you're pitching something to a prospective client, and he will think was, how do you counter, for instance, when somebody attacks your pitch in a specific way and tries to force you to lower your price that way. Well, if the person you're role playing with doesn't stick to the scenario, you don't get to practice that. You get to practice something else, but not what you were supposed to practice. And that's why I say that it's difficult to be a good training partner, because we very often instinctively just do something else, we want to do our own thing, or just mess up whatever our partner is supposed to learn. I have to point something else out. Again, Orlando said this in his first book, and he said, all training is but a simulation of reality. And the key word is simulation. What that means is that only real is real. Training is not real. That's not real life. Now you can try to get close to it, but it's not real life until you're actually fighting for your life, or if you do combat sports, until you're actually in the ring or the cage or on the mat, and your opponent is doing all he can to beat you up, beat you, knock you out, and so on. The training's not real. You try to come as close as you can, but it means that you will always have to make compromises for safety's sake, obviously. Let's say that you do a martial art with edged weapons. Well, in many cases, you're going to use practice weapons that are blunted, that are safe to use if you make a mistake, because we all make mistakes when we train, right? If you were to use a sharpened edge, and granted, I know some people who do that very successfully. If you use a sharp blade or a sharp sword, well, all of a sudden you're going to have to train differently than if you're in a real fight, because you will end up killing somebody or injuring them very, very badly. So then you have to train in a different way. And then again, it doesn't become real anymore because you have to hold back for safety reasons. So training is never real. You have to get that through your head. It's always a simulation and a compromise. Now, the goal of that simulation is that you isolate certain factors so you can actually get better at doing them. Now, that means that you practice bits and pieces of whatever curriculum that you're learning, and your teacher decides, right, we're going to focus on the footwork now, we're not going to focus on the arms, we're going to focus now on the arms. You're doing groundwork, we're just going to focus on getting from one dominant position to the next. You don't do the arm bar yet, just get into position first. And you're always focusing on very, very specific things. And then when you get good enough at these improved skills, they need to be integrated into a larger whole of other drills and other training. And then eventually they need to come out in free-form training or sparring. And if you only focus on one of these, that's not good, regardless of which one it is. Sparring, just sparring in and of itself isn't enough. You have to fix the mistakes that you do in sparring. Just doing technique isn't enough. You have to test them in a way that forces you to pull them off when it is more real than when just your partner is feeding you this very slow and easily defended against punch. So I believe that it needs to be a balance between different ones, let's call them modalities of training. You've got one-step sparring, you've got slow technique, you've got scenario sparring, you've got full-on sparring, you got sparring with lots of speed but not a lot of power, you've got sparring where somebody's handicapped, can only use one arm instead of the other, and so on. Loads and loads of different modalities in different training phases. Here's my point. Stick to the training mode you're supposed to follow. Don't mix them. That is one of the biggest mistakes that I see, where students end up not being a good partner because they mix the different modes. They don't hear or don't listen to the teacher when he says, this is what I want you to practice. What are some of these things? Well, there's basic technical learning. So there's just basically learning technique, put your left hand here, put your right leg there, and so on. That is one mode. You can do that at high speed later on. You can use a lot of power, or you can do it slow and relaxed. Those are other modalities that you add to them. And then you can do one attack, or it could be more. And then it means, can you improvise that on the spot or not? And then we get to the mode of, can you resist when somebody does that to you or not? And then there's the mode of, what do you do when your partner makes a mistake? Do you get to counter him or not? So all these different modalities and ways of practicing are determined by the teacher, not by you, the student. That is the critical mistake. You do not get to counter your partner unless the teacher says that you can. Because otherwise you are in a different mode. You are in mode where you have to test how well your partner is doing the technique. If the teacher has put him in basic technical learning mode and you're doing already the countering part, your partner doesn't learn. You also don't learn anything because he's not doing it the way he should when he is in the mode that you are, because he's not ready for that. So nobody's learning anything. So all these things that I said are determined by the teacher. What speed are you going at? Are you going to use strength or not? Can you hit once? You hit more than once? Can you pick your attack? Do you have to do a specific one? Can you resist? Can you not resist? Can you fight your way out of the technique when he messes it up or not? So if you're not sure what you're supposed to be doing, just ask. Ask your teacher, like, hey, can I do this? And he's going to say yes or no. And then you both know. Because that's also how accidents happen, when you are doing it one way and your partner does it another way, and all of a sudden you do something that he didn't expect, and you injure each other. Now, mind you, all these different training modes, they have value, but for different reasons. And a common mistake a common background issue that I see when it comes to this mistake is that people, they think that intensity equals quality of training, and that's not true. It's not because you're not going full tilt every single second of the training that you're not training well. Quite on the contrary. And the same goes to the difficulty level or the speed. Going fast isn't always the best way to train something. And putting a white belt with a black belt who's gonna just basically turn the white belt into a pretzel, that's also not necessarily a good way to train. I'm not saying it doesn't have any value. I'm saying that all different modes have value. Now, let's take an example. So one of the training formats that happens a lot. It's not the only one. I'm well aware of it. It's not the only one. But I'm going to use this as an example because it, again, exemplifies my point really well. So somebody feeds a technique, somebody receives a technique. Now, more advanced drills, they have less structure, more freedom, but there is still some structure, and you need to stick to it. You need to stick to that concept of you've got a feeder, you've got a receiver, you've got uke, you've got tori. This is very, very common. Why? Well, because it works. It's a good format for a specific mode of training, typically the mode of training you start with. Now, the biggest mistake is this. It's when the attack is predetermined, the defense is so as well, and you stick to it. Do not change your attack to stop your partner from doing its technique, because you can't predict the future. The only reason this works is because you know what he will do next. How do you know? Because the teacher just showed you. The teacher just showed you what you're going to practice. You know what your partner is doing next after you throw that punch or kick or try to choke him out, whatever. You know what's coming. Obviously, you can counter him. That's like fighting a 2-year-old. Obviously, you can win. Don't do that. Why? Because in real life, you don't know that. What I do then with my students is often say like, hey, okay, so you were actually hitting in a direction where you thought you know that it's going to go as you punch. And I call this the heat-seeking missile, because it's just the partner moves to the left or the right in his technique, and that fist that the attacker throws also follows that direction. Now, in real life, you don't get to do that. In real life, nobody throws a slow punch that can change direction in as you react to it. They might throw feints and fakes, they might do that, but a slow punch like that changes direction midstream, not very likely. So try to avoid getting into that mindset or subconsciously doing it. And I've seen this over and over again with students of all arts and all shapes and sizes and experience levels, is that they just throw this heat-seeking missile. And I tell them that what I didn't do is like, right, okay, when they don't get it, some don't. Some are a little bit naughty in that they do that just to because they think it's fun. I say, right, okay, I'm going to do the technique with you, and so they have to attack me then, and I'll just stand there and say, right, so you threw the punch, blah blah blah, so the technique, great, okay, so do it just like you just did, throw it towards where I'm stepping, and then I show them like, look, I now have to adapt my technique. It's not that I can't defend against what you're doing, it's that I have to do something different, because the technique I wanted you to practice as my student doesn't work when the angle you throw changes. It doesn't work anymore. So I need to do something else. Doesn't mean I don't know how to do something else. It only means that I cannot practice the technique that I showed. So you're basically messing up my teaching right here. Now we start again, and I say, right, so you're going to throw a punch, right? Okay, I'm not going to do this technique that I just showed. I'm going to do something else. What will I do? Tell me. They look at me a little bit funny. I said, no, we'll answer the question. What am I going to do next? That is not the technique that I just showed you. And then they say, I don't know. My response is, exactly. In real life, you also don't know. So stick to the technique that we're learning. You don't expect somebody to react to an improvised technique in the beginning phase of technical learning. You do that after. Now, I know, again, people have different modes of training. People have different approaches to training. I am talking from the perspective of long-term training where there is a method, a specific method and a specific curriculum that is built where each block is reinforcing the next block. If I only have 5 hours of time to train somebody, I'm not going to teach it that way. Obviously, I've done it many times where people only have a limited amount of time before they have to use the techniques. And then we do a seminar or we do 5 or 6 weeks of training at a rate of 2 hours of training a week. In the meantime, they have homework, and then we go about it a different way. But what I will say is that if you already test the technique right away with that sort of say heat-seeking missile, it's not going to work. Your partner won't be able to pull it off, and you won't learn anything either, because you know how to hit somebody if you know where he's going. So an aspect of that is that how can you fix that? Well, even as you go slow with your partner, when you throw that technique to that punch at him, try to use the same body mechanics and the same angle of attack in your technique than if you were doing it for real. So that means that you throw it the same way you normally would, and then your partner can react to the technique correctly using what the teacher just showed, and you can practice attacking techniques correctly. Both partners are supposed to be training. I posted this on Facebook not that long ago. It's not one person training, it's two people training at the same time. One is defending, one is attacking. And this is one of the things that I see just people do wrong over and over as well, is that they just throw this crappy attack. This attack is just more or less going in the right direction. It's more or less the right technique, but they're just launching it out there, and then the partner needs to defend against it, as opposed to throwing a real quote-unquote attack, meaning the mechanics are there, the range is correct, the timing is correct, the distance is correct, and all the things that are supposed to be in that technique are in it. The only thing that's not there is full speed, full power. That's the difference. But for the rest, they hit correctly. That is something that you need to practice if you want to be a good student to your partner, and something you expect your training partners to give you as well. So feed the technique correctly. Now, this brings me to the second biggest mistake that I see, and that is don't counter your partner unless the teacher says you can do so. Now, he can't practice if you counter him every single time. You only counter him when teacher says you can. Now, it's very simple. If I'm supposed to defend against, I don't know, you try to grab me by the throat and I clear your arm and then I put you in an arm bar or whatever, I hit you, whatever. And then every single time I clear your arm from my throat and I try to punch you, you parry that punch. Well, I'm learning that my technique doesn't work. That's what I'm learning. You're learning that, once again, when you can predict the future, you can affect it successfully. Because if you know when I'm going to throw that punch, at what target, and with which technique and which arm, well, it's not that hard to defend against it. So you're not learning anything, neither am I. Nobody's learning anything. So the only moment that you counter is when your teacher actually says that that you're allowed to counter. I'll give you two quick examples. So I was at a Wing Chun seminar, oh God, many years ago, well over 20 years ago. And I was working with a young guy who didn't have a lot of experience. And the seminar instructor showed out, I don't remember what it is. I think it was Paksao followed by punch and some throat chop, not quite sure. And I would attack my training partner. He'd do the Paksao and the rest. And it was great, fine. And then it was his turn, and every single time that he attacked and I did the Paksao followed by the combination, he tried to block and parry everything I throwed, which meant intercepting some of the techniques, which also meant that I couldn't throw them correctly because he was stopping them before they got into the right range and the right angles and so on. And I said, look, dude, I mean, I paid a lot of money to learn from this guy, and you're making it impossible for me. And he was going like, yeah, well, I'm just practicing and this and that. I said, okay, fine. I said, I'll do it your way. And when it was my turn to attack him, I did the exact same thing, with the difference that as I was bigger and stronger than him, it wasn't very difficult for me to shut him down completely. So then he got upset. And I said, dude, you're just I'm doing what you did to me. It's not my fault that I'm better at it than you. So maybe, just maybe, we can both let each other work, and then we can learn something. And then he finally got it, and it was over. Now, as a negative example, let me give you a positive one. I was in Monterey, California a while ago, and there's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school there. I forget which one it is. I think it was one of the Gracie schools. I don't remember, but I was walking down the street, saw it, and there was a white belt class going on. And I asked if I could watch for a while, and the instructor came over. It's a very friendly guy. He said, sure, and if you have any questions, it's fine. And I think we stayed for about 10-15 minutes. What I really enjoyed was the quality of instruction of the teacher to the white belts. He had an instructor, an assistant instructor with him. They worked together, they worked as a team. And one of the really great things that I saw there, what I mean with that, it's an excellent example of how the training modes went. The white belts were shown probably either their first or one of their first arm bars. So how do you get to the position from the mount? You switch the angle, you place your foot here, put your hand on his face, grab the arm this way, and so on. Just a step-by-step process, as you BJJ guys and MMA guys know. And he ends up doing the armbar, shows it in different ways, explains to the students, and then at the end of that, he says, okay, watch this, make sure you get the C grips, make sure you have this, keep your knees tight, and so on. Okay, and now very gently put some pressure on that technique. And once you can do that correctly, he said he asked the assistant instructor, hey, can you get out? Okay, you can try to get out of it now. He says, can you do that? Okay, for about 5 seconds, the assistant instructor struggled to get out of the armbar, got nowhere, and that was it. Here's my point. He only gets to struggle at the end. Why? Well, the assumption is that the white belts will not be able to immediately get every single step right, and that they might, once they get to the end of it, still have some small errors in the technique that will allow somebody with enough training or with enough strength to get out of the armbar. But if they do everything right, then the guy will not get out of it. So they need to learn how to do it right first. If their partner counters them along the way to that armbar, so during all the different steps that they take to get there, well, they don't get to the armbar, so they don't learn it. If the partner fights as soon as the armbar is on, where they get to the last part of the technique, and then immediately fights his way out of it before the student has had the time to check all the little tweaks and corrections he's supposed to make, well, he's also not learning. He's always learning to fail. Nobody teaches like that. Well, let's put it differently. Outside of the martial arts world, that's not how you teach. You don't teach people to constantly fail. You only stress test them when they have something that they can work with, that they have something worthwhile to test. A white belt who's in his second class doesn't have that yet. So there's no point to it other than fun, because it's fun to mess somebody up maybe for some people. Well, yeah, sure. Not as much fun for the person on the receiving end. So I will end that with being a good training partner is hard, and it takes a lot of practice, and it takes the willingness to get good at it. You have to want to be a good training partner. If you don't want to be a good training partner, you don't have any business in my class. I don't want those people around because they're wasting everybody's time, including mine and their own. If you want to be a good training partner, try some of the suggestions that I made and in the previous section here, and see if you could improve that. Then we get to the third and final most common error that I see students make, and that is not fundamentally correcting errors and mistakes. What does that mean? You have to practice the corrections that your teacher gives you. You have to focus on it, and if your teacher sees you make a mistake, he says, hey, do it this way as opposed to what you were doing, and then he walks away and you don't correct it, well, what's the point? You keep on doing it wrong. So what I usually do is I give corrections and I tell the students, well, okay, just practice this for the next few minutes. This, you did left hand center, right? Practice this for the next few minutes. So that way I'm sure that they not only know the correction, but they also understand it and they have the time to ingrain it a little bit more, or at the very least do it enough time so that they remember it for next time or for next class. And still not everybody sticks to that. I turn around and when I look back 10 seconds later, I see that they resumed the other part of the training. Can't help that. If that's what you do, if you don't want to listen to your teacher, it begs the question, well, why are you in class to begin with? But then you don't get corrected, then you don't learn, you don't make progress. Now, another aspect is that do the homework. If you want to come to class, progress is going to be slow. It's not too, if you have 6-7 classes a week, okay, that's something else. But most people have 1 to 2 classes a week. And if you only train there, don't expect to make massive progress. It's not going to happen. In particular, when it comes to corrections. Now, what I still tell beginning students, practice a few minutes every day. It doesn't have to be a full workout. Just, you can go through the motions if you want to, but just repeat it. And then if you receive corrections in class, focus on those corrections first. Focus specifically on those parts of whatever technique or whatever you were supposed to be doing that your teacher says, hey, this isn't right, you need to do it like this. And then he moves on, okay, get home and practice. The days between class, practice. And then next class, you hopefully have ingrained that correction a little bit more. And when you try the technique, then your teacher is obviously probably going to notice it and he can teach you something else, or you get better at sparring because of this, and so on. So do that for years, just a few minutes a day, for weeks, months on end, and for years. It adds up. It makes a huge difference. Now, if you don't do it, that's fine. But as long as you don't correct that technique, the teacher's just going to have to correct you over and over until you get it right. The consequence is that sometimes you end up in a dead-end street in your training. And it stops all progress until you correct that specific part. I'll give you an example from my Tai Chi class. Now, we have the knee-foot rule. What that means is that the knee always has to point in the same direction as the foot. That is a standard biomechanical rule of how the human body moves best. Yes, I know there are exceptions. Yes, I know it's not as black and white, but again, bear with me. I'm giving you an example. Now, in the style that I teach, this is a foundational component of it. You cannot complete the puzzle that is a style if that piece doesn't fit because it has the wrong shape. You need to have that knee-foot rule down. And there are also levels to it, how it's performed. You start at a very basic understanding of what that means, but as you progress in your training, you're going to understand better how that actually affects everything else. So until you master the basic level, you cannot make progress. You will not advance in the art. And there are also certain skills you're supposed to learn over time that will not be available to you until you master that knee-foot rule, meaning until you no longer make mistakes against this. And I tell students this all the time. I said, fix this first. I give them exercises and drills to do back at home. And I can tell who does these drills at home, who does the homework and who doesn't. Because often it's even apparent after a few days when I see them next class or the week after. I can tell who did the homework drills that I gave them, because they make progress. All of a sudden things click and they move better. And that's the whole point of doing these small correction exercises at home, is that you don't have to spend valuable training time correcting things that you can correct by yourself at home. If your teacher has to focus on that a lot, well, I mean, it's okay. I tell my students who make the same mistake over and over, so I'm willing to correct you, that's not it. But it's such a shame, especially for you, that you can't make progress. And I cannot help you make progress until you fix this, because it's a fundamental issue. So that is something that I believe should be a huge part of your learning curve, is whenever you get corrected, spend a large amount of time on ingraining those corrections, making sure you don't make the mistake again. And we're going to fail, we're going to fall down and make mistakes. Everybody does it. It's fine. Don't worry about it. But make the effort. Make the effort, because it's the only way you get better. that's pretty much it. That was, we're closing in on the 1 hour mark. So it's a little bit longer than I wanted to go. I was hoping for a 30-minute episode, but went a little bit off track here and ended up with a lot more and giving more examples than I have on my list here. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you found it useful. I will be back in a few weeks with the next episode, and I should have a guest on, but I'm not going to say who because it's not quite certain. It could be one of 3 people who said yes to the interview. So I won't announce that just yet, but that's coming up. Now, again, as always, you can help out the podcast by sharing this episode with people you think that might enjoy it. Share it on social media, on your site, email it to people. Obviously, hit the like and subscribe button. That would be great as well. If you can, pretty please with sugar on top, leave a review, preferably on iTunes. That's really great because the reviews help a lot in getting more visibility for the podcast. And well, it's not entirely altruistic in the sense for you guys, because the bigger the podcast show gets, the more guests that I can get to say yes to an interview. So that is one of the reasons why it benefits all of us. If you guys give, again, an honest review on iTunes would be great. And then obviously you can support me on Patreon and support the show at patreon.com/Wim Demeere. Now, speaking of which, I am opening a call for anybody who wants to let me know if you have specific guests you'd like me to interview. So leave me a comment wherever you listen to this, whether it is on my Facebook page, that's the easiest way to do it. Or if you watch this on YouTube, you can leave a comment there. Let me know if you have an idea of a guest. Obviously, somebody who has something to tell in relation to self-defense, martial arts, surviving violence, and so on. I'm probably not going to interview some rapper. I don't think that's going to be of much interest to anybody. So let me know if you have ideas for guests, and I'll see what I can do. All right, that's it, everybody. Thank you very much for listening, and for the people on YouTube, thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you next time.